I pulled up to my family farm on Christmas morning just trying to spend the holiday where I grew up. No party, no damage, no rules broken. The farm was inherited, struggling but still ours. Then an HOA truck blocked the gate. A woman stepped out and said the property was under HOA control and I wasn't allowed inside. People tried to explain it was private land. She didn't listen. She said the farm was bankrupt and no longer mine. She called security and said they'd escort me off. Neighbors gathered. Phones came out. Guards arrived acting confident and untouchable. What they didn't know was this: that bankrupt farm belonged to me. And I was FBI before I tell you what happened next. Tell me where you're watching from. And please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. I pulled up to my family farm on Christmas morning just trying to spend the holiday where I grew up. The sky was pale and cold, a kind of winter light that made everything feel quiet and honest. There was no party planned, no guests coming, and no noise beyond the crunch of gravel under my tires. I'd come alone, carrying groceries and a few wrapped gifts, hoping to unlock the old gate, walk the land, and remember my parents the way I always did at the end of the year. Nothing about that morning broke a rule, crossed a boundary, or invited trouble. The farm itself had seen better days, but it was still standing. The barn leaned slightly, the fences needed repair, and the fields rested under a thin frost. It was inherited land, passed down through hard years and harder work. And while money had been tight lately, the place was still ours. I had the deed. I had the records. I had the memories. That should have been enough. As I slowed near the entrance, something felt wrong. A white HOA truck was parked sideways across the gate, blocking it completely. Its engine was still running, exhaust rising in short white clouds. I stopped a few feet back, confused more than angry, and stepped out of my car. Before I could even speak, the driver's door of the truck opened. A woman in a press jacket and sunglasses stepped out like she owned the land beneath her boots. She did not greet me or ask why I was there. She simply told me, flat and loud, that the property was now under HOA control and that I was not allowed inside. Her voice carried the kind of confidence that expected obedience, not conversation. I told her calmly that this was private land and that I was the owner. She shook her head and said ownership no longer mattered. She claimed the farm had been declared bankrupt and absorbed under new management. I asked her to show documentation. She refused and repeated herself louder, as if volume could replace proof. A couple of nearby neighbors, drawn by the truck and the raised voices, walked closer. One of them explained that this farm had never been part of any neighborhood association. Another pointed out that there were no HOA signs anywhere for miles. The woman ignored them all. She said the decision had already been made, and that arguing would only make things worse. Then she pulled out her phone and called security. She said they would escort me off the property if I didn't leave immediately. She said it casually, like it was routine, like she had done this before and expected the same outcome every time. I felt the mood shift as more people gathered. Phones came out. Someone started recording. Christmas morning suddenly felt tense and exposed. A few minutes later, 2 security vehicles arrived. The guards stepped out wearing matching jackets and identical expressions. They looked confident, almost smug, like they had already decided how this would end. One of them told me I was trespassing. Another told me I had no right to be there. None of them asked questions. None of them listened. I stood there holding my keys, looking at the gate I had unlocked 1,000 times in my life, now treated like a boundary I was forbidden to cross. The woman watched with folded arms, satisfied, certain that authority had finally arrived to back her up. The neighbors whispered. The cameras kept rolling. What none of them knew was this: that so-called bankrupt farm still belonged to me, and I was FBI. The woman finally introduced herself. Not with a name anyone recognized, but with a title she clearly enjoyed using. She said she was the regional authority for a newly expanded homeowners association one that had supposedly taken responsibility for neglected and unmanaged rural properties. She spoke as if she were reading from a script, confident and rehearsed, as though repeating the words enough times would make them unquestionable. Every sentence ended with the same assumption that her authority was absolute and that resistance was pointless. She lifted a clipboard and waved it slightly, letting the top page flutter in the cold breeze. From where I stood, I could see lines and stamps, but nothing specific. I asked her calmly and clearly to show me the documentation that proved the farm was under HOA control. I asked for parcel numbers, court filings, or any notice of transfer. She refused without hesitation and said the documents were internal and not required to be shared with me. That answer alone drew murmurs from the neighbors. I explained that the land had been in my family for 3 generations, purchased long before any association existed in the area. I told her I held the original deed and updated county records showing current ownership. I did not raise my voice. I did not insult her. I simply stated facts. She responded with a laugh that felt practiced, almost dismissive. and said deeds were meaningless once a property was absorbed by an HOA operating under Emergency Management Authority. That phrase caught my attention. Emergency authority was not something an HOA could simply declare. It required court orders, notices, and public filings. I asked her which court issued the order, and on what date. Her expression tightened for just a moment before she recovered, and said the information was above my clearance. One of the neighbors shook his head openly at that point, clearly unconvinced. The guards remained silent but alert, shifting their weight and watching me closely. Their posture suggested they were waiting for permission to act, not clarity about the situation. I noticed again that none of them wore visible identification beyond generic patches. There were no badge numbers, no company names stitched on their jackets, and no visible licensing information. It was a small detail, but an important one. I asked the guards directly who employed them and under what authority they were enforcing a removal order. One of them replied that they were contracted by the HOA and did not need to explain further. When I asked whether they were licensed to enforce property access, he told me to stop asking questions and prepare to leave. The woman nodded approvingly, clearly pleased that the conversation was shifting back in her favor. More neighbors had gathered by then, standing along the road and near the fence line. Some of them had lived near the farm for decades. They knew who owned it. They knew its history. A few spoke up, saying they had never received any notice about an HOA expansion or property seizure. The woman cut them off sharply and said misinformation would not be tolerated. That only fueled the tension. I could feel the situation tightening, like a knot being pulled too fast. The woman was relying entirely on confidence and intimidation, not law. The guards were relying on her word without verification, and the neighbors were caught between disbelief and concern, unsure how far this might go. The fact that it was Christmas morning made the whole scene feel even more wrong. I looked again at the gate, the rusted hinges, the familiar lock, and the land beyond it. This was not just property. It was history. It was family. And it was being challenged by people who clearly expected no resistance. The woman repeated her claim one more time, slower and louder, as if delivering a final warning. She said the farm was no longer mine, and that failure to comply would result in removal. That was when I understood something important. She was not confused. She was not mistaken. She was counting on fear, on people backing down, on no one knowing how to push back, and she had chosen the wrong place, the wrong day, and the wrong person to try it on. One of the guards finally stepped forward, boots crunching on the gravel, as if the sound itself was meant to intimidate. He told me I had 5 minutes to leave the property, or I would be removed for trespassing. His voice was firm, rehearsed, and empty of any actual authority. I asked him calmly who issued that order. He did not answer directly. Instead, he pointed back at the woman by the HOA truck as if her presence alone settled the matter. I looked at her and asked again for proof. She crossed her arms and said she did not owe explanations to people who no longer owned the land. The guard repeated his warning, this time counting down from 5 with exaggerated patience. It was clear why I expected compliance, not conversation. They were used to people backing down once uniforms and threats appeared. I did not move. Instead, I asked a simple question. I asked whether he understood that removing a lawful property owner without legal documentation constituted unlawful detention and trespass on their part. He frowned, clearly unprepared for that response. He told me I was overcomplicating things, and that this was not a debate. The woman smirked, certain the moment was still hers. I slowly took out my phone and began recording. I did not announce it. I simply held it at chest level, capturing the truck blocking the gate, the guards, the woman, and the growing crowd of neighbors. The woman noticed almost immediately. She snapped at me to stop filming, claiming it violated HOA policy. I asked her to point out where such a policy applied to private land. She could not. The guard nearest me shifted his stance and told me to put the phone away. I asked him if he was ordering me to stop recording in a public-facing area on private property I owned. He hesitated. That hesitation did not go unnoticed by the neighbors. A few of them raised their own phones higher, making it clear that whatever happened next would be documented from multiple angles. The woman's confidence began to crack. Her voice grew sharper, less controlled. She accused me of being hostile and uncooperative. She said my behavior was suspicious. I pointed out that arriving uninvited, blocking a gate, and threatening removal without paperwork was far more suspicious. That earned a few quiet nods from the crowd. The guards conferred briefly among themselves, speaking in low voices. One of them suggested they physically escort me away from the gate to de-escalate the situation. I asked him how forcibly removing someone from land they owned would de-escalate anything. He did not answer. Instead, he stepped close enough that I could smell coffee on his breath. That was when I noticed another detail. The security vehicles parked behind the HOA truck had no company markings, no license numbers displayed on the sides, and no visible permits on the windshields. They looked official at a glance, but the closer you looked, the more generic they appeared. It was all surface-level authority, built to impress, not to withstand scrutiny. I told the guard to take one step back and said I would not be leaving my property. I told him that if he touched me, he would be doing so without lawful authority and in front of multiple witnesses. His jaw tightened. For a moment, it looked like he might try anyway. Then someone in the crowd spoke up and reminded him that everything was being recorded live. The woman raised her voice again, declaring that she was invoking emergency enforcement powers. She said the farm was unsafe, unmanaged, and subject to immediate control. I asked her what specific hazard justified emergency action. She said it was under review. I asked who conducted the review. She said it was confidential. Each answer only made her position weaker. Christmas decorations on a nearby porch fluttered slightly in the breeze, a strange and quiet reminder of how out of place this confrontation was. Children watched from a distance, confused by the tension. Neighbors who had planned peaceful mornings now stood in a loose semicircle, witnessing something that felt increasingly wrong. The guard checked his watch and announced that my time was up. He took another step toward me, then stopped. He looked at the phones. He looked at the neighbors. He looked back at the woman who nodded sharply, urging him on. And still he did not touch me. In that pause, the entire situation shifted. The power they thought they had was slipping, not because of force, but because of exposure. They were being watched, questioned, and challenged. Their authority existed only as long as no one pushed back. I told them they were free to leave at any time, but that I was not going anywhere. I told them the gate would remain closed until they moved their truck. I told them that every second they stayed without legal justification only made their situation worse. The woman opened her mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since she arrived, she seemed unsure of what to say next. The escort they promised never happened. Instead, the standoff lingered, heavy and unresolved. With the truth pressed closer by the second, the woman's patience finally ran out. The confidence she arrived with had thinned, replaced by irritation she could no longer hide. She stepped a few feet away from the group, turned her back slightly as if to reclaim control of the moment, and pulled out her phone again. Loud enough for everyone to hear, she announced that she was calling county enforcement to report an illegal entry attempt on seized property. She made sure to emphasize the word seized and illegal, repeating them like anchors she hoped would hold her story together. As she spoke to the dispatcher, her voice shifted into something rehearsed and official. She claimed the farm had been declared bankrupt, that it was under emergency HOA administration, and that I was attempting to force my way onto land I no longer owned. She added that I was being uncooperative and that private security on site felt threatened. Several neighbors exchanged looks at that last part, clearly confused by how quietly everyone had been standing. I listened carefully, not interrupting her once. When she finished, she looked back at me with a thin smile that suggested the outcome was already decided. She said enforcement would be there shortly, and that things would go much worse for me if I continued to resist. One of the guards relaxed his shoulders, visibly relieved, as if outside authority was the safety net he had been waiting for. When the call ended, I calmly asked her for the incident number. She hesitated, then gave it. I asked which department she contacted and whether a supervisor had been notified of a disputed property seizure involving private citizens. She told me that was none of my concern. I nodded and took out my phone again, this time placing a call of my own. I did not raise my voice. I did not step away. I simply requested confirmation that county enforcement was being dispatched under claims of bankruptcy, seizure, and emergency HOA control. I asked that a supervisory NG officer be notified immediately due to conflicting ownership claims and the presence of unlicensed private security. The tone on the other end of the line changed quickly. I could hear keys tapping and a pause that suggested records were being checked. The woman watched me closely, her expression tightening again. She asked who I was calling. I told her I was making sure the responding officers had accurate information before arriving. She scoffed and said they would straighten everything out soon enough. Still, she kept glancing toward the road, as if expecting flashing lights to appear at any second. While we waited, the tension settled into something heavier. The guards stopped posturing and began whispering among themselves. One of them asked the woman quietly whether she was certain about the bankruptcy status. She snapped at him to stay in line. That exchange did not go unnoticed by the neighbors, who leaned in closer, sensing that something was unraveling. A few minutes passed. Then a few more. No sirens, no lights, just the cold air and the sound of distant traffic. The woman checked her phone and frowned. She muttered something about delays and coverage issues. I stood still, hands visible, recording continuing without interruption. Finally, a patrol vehicle appeared at the far end of the road. It slowed as it approached the gathering, taking in the blocked gate, the HOA truck, the security vehicles, and the crowd. The woman straightened immediately, her confident returning in a rush. She stepped forward to meet the deputy before he even parked. She spoke quickly, pointing at me and repeating her claims. She said the property was seized. She said I was trespassing. She said private security had already instructed me to leave. The deputy listened without interrupting, his expression neutral, his eyes moving from her to the gate to the neighbors still filming. When it was my turn to speak, I did not argue. I did not accuse. I simply stated that I was the lawful owner of the farm, that no bankruptcy proceedings existed, and that the HOA had no jurisdiction over the land. I added that the gate had been blocked without permission, and that I had been threatened with removal by unlicensed security. I then handed over my identification. The deputy took it and stepped a short distance away to make a call. The woman's face tightened again, this time with visible concern. One of the guards asked quietly whether they should leave. She told him to stay put. Her certainty was slipping, and she knew it. When the deputy returned, his posture had changed. He addressed me first, confirming my ownership and acknowledging the dispute. Then he turned to the woman and asked her for documentation supporting her claims. She produced the same clipboard, flipping through pages too quickly. The deputy asked for a court order, a seizure notice, or any county filing. She had none. The silence that followed was heady. The woman began to speak, then stopped. The deputy explained, calmly but firmly, that no records supported her claim, and that blocking access to private property without legal authority was unlawful. He informed her that impersonating authority and misrepresenting property status were serious matters. The call she thought would end the situation had done the opposite. It had brought scrutiny, records, and reality into a space where confidence alone had been carrying her. As the deputy continued speaking, the guards slowly stepped back, already distancing themselves from her decisions. Christmas morning remained cold and quiet, but the balance had shifted. The authority she tried to summon had arrived, and it was no longer on her side. The deputy asked the woman one last time if she had any legitimate documentation to support her claim. He was not impatient or aggressive, but his tone had shifted into something firm and unmistakable. This was no longer a casual inquiry. This was an official demand. The woman opened her mouth, closed it again, and then began flipping through her clipboard with shaking hands. Papers rustled, pages bent, but nothing meaningful appeared. The confidence she had relied on all morning was gone, replaced by visible panic she could not hide. One of the guards cleared his throat and quietly asked if they were clear to disengage. The woman snapped at him to stay put, but her voice cracked slightly when she did. The deputy noticed. He looked from the guards to their vehicles, and then back to the Oman, asking who exactly employed them and under what license they were operating. No one answered immediately. That silence said more than any argument could have. The deputy then turned to me and asked if I would step closer so he could verify a few details. I did, handing him my identification again, along with credentials I had not planned to show unless absolutely necessary. He examined them carefully, his eyes narrowing slightly as he read. Then his posture changed completely. He straightened, took a step back, and looked at me with a new level of seriousness. He excused himself and walked back to his vehicle, speaking quietly into his radio. The wait that followed felt longer than it was. The neighbors whispered among themselves. Phones remained raised. The woman stood frozen, watching the deputy with an expression that shifted from irritation to concern to something closer to fear. The guards avoided eye contact with everyone, suddenly very interested in the ground beneath their boots. When the deputy returned, he addressed me by name. He confirmed my identity and acknowledged my position. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried clearly across the gathered crowd. The woman's face drained of color as she listened. Whatever narrative she had built in her head collapsed in real time. The deputy then turned to her and explained, step by step, what had gone wrong. He stated plainly that the farm was privately owned, that there were no bankruptcy proceedings head to it, and that no HOA had jurisdiction over the land. He informed her that blocking access to private property without lawful authority constituted trespass. He added that directing unlicensed individuals to threaten removal could rise to the level of impersonating enforcement. She tried to interrupt him, insisting there had been a misunderstanding, but he held up a hand and continued. He explained that false claims of property seizure were taken seriously, especially when used to intimidate lawful owners. He noted the presence of multiple witnesses and extensive video evidence. Each sentence landed heavier than the last. The guards began stepping back, one by one, increasing the distance between themselves and the woman. One quietly removed his jacket. Another returned to his vehicle without being told. It was clear they wanted no part of what this situation had become. The authority they thought they were enforcing had turned into a liability. The woman attempted one final defense, saying she was acting in the community's best interest. The deputy responded that community interests never outweighed the law. He informed her that she would need to provide her information for a report, and that the incident would be forwarded for further review. The word report seemed to hit her harder than anything else. The gate was ordered to be cleared immediately. The HOA truck was instructed to move. When it finally rolled forward, the sound of its tires leaving the gravel felt simple, icy, like a weight lifting from the land itself. I walked to the gate, unlocked it, and swung it open for the first time that morning. The farm lay quiet beyond it, unchanged, patient, and still mine. As I stepped through, the deputy asked if I wished to pursue further action. I told him I would consider it. For now, I wanted the incident documented and the property left alone. He nodded, understanding exactly what that meant. The woman said nothing. She stood rigid, staring at the ground. Her earlier certainty reduced to silence. The neighbors slowly dispersed, some shaking their heads, others offering quiet words of support. Christmas morning resumed its stillness, though it would never be forgotten by anyone who witnessed what had unfolded. Power had been challenged, tested, and exposed, and in the end, it had not belonged to the loudest voice or the biggest truck. It had belonged to the truth. Once the HOA truck moved and the security vehicles followed it down the road, the silence felt unfamiliar, almost unreal. What moments earlier had been filled with raised voices, accusation, and tension now returned to the quiet hum of a winter morning. The deputy remained for a few minutes longer, finishing his notes and speak briefly with a couple of neighbors who had witnessed everything from the start. His presence was calm and professional, and it helped settle the lingering unease that still hung in the air. I stood just inside the open gate, looking out across the farm. Nothing about the land had changed during the confrontation. The fields were still frost-covered. The barn still leaned slightly to the west. The trees still stood bare against the pale sky. Yet the moment felt different. There was a sense of something reclaimed, not just legally, but personally. The land had been challenged, and it had held. The deputy returned my identification and reminded me that the incident would be documented thoroughly. He assured me that any further attempts to interfere with the property would be treated seriously. I thanked him, not formally but sincerely. He nodded once, climbed back into his vehicle, and drove away, leaving tire tracks that quickly faded into the gravel road. The neighbors lingered a little longer. Some approached to apologize, even though they had done nothing wrong. Others shared their disbelief at what had happened. A few admitted they had been intimidated by the HOA before but had never seen anything like this. I told them the same thing. Authority only works when people believe in it without question. The moment it is examined, it either stands on law or collapses. Gradually, the crowd thinned. Doors closed, cars pulled away. Christmas decorations that had been forgotten during the confrontation came back into focus. Wreaths on fences, lights on porches, a distant radio playing faint holiday music somewhere down the road. The farm settled back into itself as if it had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. I walked deeper onto the property, letting the gate swing shut behind me. Each step felt grounding, familiar, honest. I passed the old fence line my father had repaired by hand, the shed where my mother used to store tools, and the spot near the tree line where we used to stop every year just to stand and look out at the land. Those memories mattered more than any document ever could. Inside the farmhouse, the air was cold but clean. I set the groceries down, lit the small heater in the living room, and stood quietly for a moment. The house creaked the way it always had, settling into the day. Outside interference had tried to claim it, to reduce it to a line item or an opportunity. It had failed. What stayed with me most was not the confrontation itself, but how easily it could have gone differently for someone else. Not everyone knows how to challenge false authority. Not everyone feels safe doing so. That realization lingered longer than the tension, longer than the anger. It turned the morning into something reflective rather than triumphant later. As the sun climbed higher and the frost began to melt, I stepped back outside and looked once more toward the road. It was empty, peaceful, ordinary. That was all I had wanted from the beginning. Not control, not victory, just the right to stand on my own land without being told I did not belong. Christmas was restored not with celebration, but with quiet, with truth, with the simple understanding that some things cannot be taken just because someone claims they can. The farm remained what it had always been. A place of work, a place of memory, a place that endured, and as the day moved forward, it was clear that while the confrontation was over, its lesson would last much longer for everyone involved.